I'm Scott Allen Miller. It's the 26th of November, 2022, and this is my vlog of daily life in Leon, Nicaragua. Today is Saturday, and it is an all work day for me. We have a lot of stuff coming up because today is the very last day of my eldest daughter being 13. Tomorrow she turns 14. That's how that works. And for her birthday, because there's not a lot of stuff we want to buy, she doesn't really want things, what we're doing is heading into Managua to have a 2-day adventure of things that she likes to do in Managua. So we're attempting to do things like bowling and laser tag and going out to eat at cool restaurants because a lot of she's always like really struggling with food and stuff here in Leon because there's just not a lot of variety and it's very difficult for her to go out and find things that she tends to like. Involves a lot of fish and sushi, vegan food because she's lactose intolerant, so she really doesn't like some people who are lactose intolerant really like cheese but struggle to eat it. She doesn't really even like it that much, so for her, vegan food actually works out pretty well. She does like eggs, but she likes to avoid dairy. So we're hoping to go out and find some restaurants that she really likes and explore some new ones and go to some traditional ones that she likes. Yeah, so that's our plan for her birthday. But because of that, today, even though it's Saturday, I have to really work hard to make sure I'm caught up on everything because I'm going to be gone tomorrow, so I don't have my normal weekend to catch up a little bit. And we're going to be gone on Monday as well. So it's just a busy day. There's a lot of logistics and stuff that need to be done. We're just generally busy, and we're traveling to the United States in just over 2 weeks. We'll be up there on the 15th of December. So we really have a tight schedule that we're dealing with. So today was a work day, and I have nothing real to report about the day. My topic for today has nothing to do with travel. There's this beagle likes to bark at me. He's such a barker, but he's so cute. He's so cute. My topic of the day is a little bit different than normal, and I want to talk about this because it's so goofy, but Paul and I were talking this morning and he had this trivia question, right? Well, according to Jeopardy, 3 people lost all of their savings because they asked the question, what is the date on which the 20th century start? And of course, everybody thinks they know the answer and they answer January 1st, 1900. They think that the trick question is it the 19th century or the 1900s? People always get that wrong because obviously the 1900s are the 20th century. And so they think about that and then they don't realize that it's actually January 1st, 1901, and that 1900 is part of the 19th century, which is contrary actually to what at least I was taught in school. We were always taught that the 1900s were the 20th century and that those two things overlapped. So, I mean, I get that schools teach things wrong all the time. My school also taught that 1 o'clock in the morning is midnight. For real, they actually taught that. And that one I have to mention, that was because one of the rich families, who had kids in the school, this is the danger of private schools, right? It was a rich family and their family believed that. And so they told the school that's what they had to teach. And so they did. It really pointed out what kind of idiots went to the school and how stupid the teachers were. Hola! And I wanted to record today up by the church because they're going to hang out, but they're being really loud and playing music, super loud, so there's no way to be near it. So I'm just walking down the street looking for a quiet place to record. So I want to talk about this, though, because I think when we answer that question, when is the first day of the century, and then we say, well, it's 1901, January 1st, 1901, we all know that's wrong. It feels wrong. How can it feel so wrong and be the correct answer? So I did some digging into this because it's interesting because I don't feel confident that that's the correct answer. And I've been in these trivia things before, like when I was in high school, I did it, and they're pretty sloppy about the things that they do. So before I dig into this, I want an important takeaway. Trivia, in order to be useful, has to be correct, and it has to be definitively correct. For example, in what year did Christopher Columbus first sail to the New World? Well, it was 1492. There was no other possible year to use as an answer, right? That makes it a good trivia question because you could say, in what year did he come to the New World? Well, he came multiple times, so you can't ask that. It has to be what was his first time. He didn't secretly come before 1492. There's no dispute about there being something before 1492. It's simply 1492. So that is a good trivia question, and that works. The problem with something like what is the first day of the century is if you start looking into it, what you find immediately is that this is a disputed number. It's also a number that doesn't have any definitive source for correctness. And so if you go, and of course, the thing that I'm told is, well, if you go to Wikipedia and ask what's the first day of the century, it says one thing. But if you dig into Wikipedia, you can find 2 other pages that dispute that page. So even within a single source, it is unclear what it is. And even if that thing says it, even if Wikipedia we take to be the definitive answer, we have to look into what their sources are. And the problem with a thing like a calendar is that there is no definitive first thing. Now we can say, well, according to the Julian calendar, according to the Gregorian calendar, but neither of those had a date for centuries. Neither of them addressed that, so it doesn't exist. So the first thing is, this is not a trivia question. It doesn't qualify for the things you need to have for something to be a valid trivia question. That's the first thing. So from a Jeopardy standpoint, they failed. And I believe they also failed on the answer, because if you're going to say, well, there's an answer that's reasonably the correct one, I think the one that they chose is wrong. And I'm going to dig into that because this is interesting, because once Paul said it, I'm like, I'm not okay with that answer. It's clearly wrong. But why? So first of all, if you dig into it, they refer to 2 things as names for this convention. The use of the first day of the numbering. So 1900 being the first day of the century is known as the common century, and 1901 is known as the strict century. Now, strict by what standard? That's just what it's called. So there's already, both of them are equally termed starts of the century. And it is accepted that 1900 is the accepted one and 1901 is a pedantic one according to somebody, but it's never clear who, because it's not the source of the calendar. If you go and look up things like U.S. Government sources, they will say it's 1901. However, the United States is in no way, and I mean, you have to understand this, in no way an authority on the calendar. It is not something that an individual government has any input into. They can say what they accept as those terms within government literature, what it applies to under laws under which they have jurisdiction, but they cannot determine what the actual calendar is. That's not within their purview, right? So first of all, you have to accept that just because a country says it doesn't actually mean very much. It's useful that this is what a large country has decided at some level is important to them. They're also the ones that set AM and PM for noon and midnight, which, by the way, there is no AM or PM for noon or midnight. But they did set what they would be when written incorrectly and then reversed it later so that it actually changed. And likewise, the United States government at some point changed when they determined the start of a century to be. So if we say, when did the 20th century start? When did the 18th century start? When did the 17th century start? We actually run into more complexity than you may think, because January 1st is only the beginning of the year more recently. When the country was founded, for example, when the United States was founded, the first day of the year, I believe, was March 25th, Ladies' Day. And for a very long time, that's when we started the year. So the idea that you could determine what century it was by January 1st is unclear. So if we're going by number of days since an event, right, which is the concept of things like Anno Domini naming, then we may argue over the year, but the date is wrong. So the actual day of the year. So any trivia or anybody trying to answer this based off of what it's always been and based off of the Anno Domini portion of the naming convention is automatically wrong, because the date accepted for that is either December 25th by the Christian calendar or March 25th by the standard Gregorian calendar, and the January 1st number is an arbitrary Romanization of the name after the fact. Because part of the purpose of the Gregorian calendar was not to honor the Roman consuls, but to honor Christ instead, and the move back to January 1st is a move back to the consul date. And it makes sense for a lot of reasons to use January 1st, and it had some tradition in the Julian calendar, which was consul based, but it's not. So all of those theories of the Gregorian calendar going back and using the centuries in that way, whatever they're based on doesn't hold up. So we can't use that as an argument for when the dates are. If we go by the 1900s being the 20th century, which is often how it is taught, then obviously we're stating that 1900 must fall into that category and can't be in the previous century. So we already have a dispute there. Now, we can argue that those are just conventions and they don't exactly overlap, and that's valid, but we all know that they kind of should. The concept that the first century means something is kind of based on those naming conventions, right? Now, here's the big one. Mathematically, the argument is, and this is kind of the foundation that most people use for saying that it has to be this one shifted year, 1901, not 1900, and I'll call it the math argument. The math argument says that the calendar starts at 1 AD, and so from 1 AD, because we're all thinking, the reason we think 1900 counts is because it's a zero. So 0 through 99 is the first century, 100 through 199 is the second century. This is how we do modern math. And people will make this argument. So there's two arguments. The first one is the non-zero argument. Well, back when they started the calendar, they didn't have the number 0. That is false. The calendar was started in the 1500s, about 800 years after Europeans had the number 0. So absolutely 0 was in use at the time that the calendar was invented. So that's absolute false, like just made up. Now, the idea that the calendar has no 0 year, this is kind of valid in a way. We were taught as children that Anno Domini starts at 1. From the moment the year started, you're at year 1, which is obviously mathematically wrong. And because it's not the first year after, it's the 0 year after. You have to go a whole year to be a year after. And that going the other way, it starts at -1, leaving no 0 year. You're at +1 and -1, or 1 AD, 1 BC, without any 0. And obviously that's wacky and causes all kinds of problems. There's two really strong arguments against using that from a math perspective. And the first is that, well, you simply count the first year of BC as the 0 year. Obviously, that's how it would work. And if you're going the other way, the first year of AD is the 0 year of BC. But more importantly, in 1988, and this is the most definitive thing you could possibly have for something like a calendar, other than if the creator of a calendar had defined these things. That's really important. There is no founding definition, so there's nothing definitive. So the best, most closest things that we can have to definitive is either common use. Common use says 1900 and that there's a 0 year. But far more importantly, the International Standards Organization, ISO, which is in Paris, it is understood the world over. It is recognized by the United Nations. It is the most recognized standard organization on an international scale by no small margin. This is the absolute international standard definition of international standards. In 1988, they sat down and dealt with exactly this question and said, this is stupid. ISO posting 8601 says clearly that what we refer to as 1 BC is definitely 0 AD, and that the calendar absolutely starts with a 0. It is no ifs, ands, or buts. It also states that the calendar dates are 4 digits. It was written to deal with the Y2K problem 12 years before it came about, all those kinds of things. And that is why we refer to the new millennium in 2000, not in 2001. That's why we talk about the centuries in 1900, not 1901. Since 1988, now it doesn't mean it wasn't correct before 1988, but as of 1988, all major governments in the world got together and coordinated to say there is a 0, and that the idea that 1901 is the new century, not 1900, is wrong. And so all the US sources that say, the US government sources that say 1901 is the first year of the 20th century are in direct dispute with the United States ratification of ISO 8601. The United States has agreed officially that that is incorrect, that it has to be 1900. And if we want to think about how centuries work, so the very first century, what we call the first century, was in the zeros, right? So if you want to have consistency, the first year should be a 0 year because the first century is the 0 century, right? The zeros. Now we call it the first century because that's the first that we're counting. It's cardinal numbers instead of ordinal numbers. But the actual number of it is the 0 century. Well, what should be the first year of the 0 century? The 0 year, obviously. If we want to have a consistency in the calendar system and call something the 1900s, the 2000s, whatever, then we have to have that 0 in there, or the calendar system is not logical. And the calendar system isn't necessarily all that logical, but every single thing you look at with the calendar agrees that the 0 year must exist. All official the most official as you can possibly be, says that 0 does exist. Every counting system depends on 0 existing. All common usage includes 0. And the only time you get this 1901 problem, 2001 problem, is when you're dealing with people who are intentionally trying to be pedantic who didn't do their research, which is a common problem with trivia, that often people who are doing trivia, and Jeopardy normally is better than this, but they're obviously not great. The problem with people doing trivia is that you never have an expert in a domain. You just have a person looking up trivia questions, and they say, ooh, what will be tricky? I was tricked with this once because someone thought they were going to outsmart me, and so I'm going to use it in this thing. And so they just quickly look up and see that a bunch of people have said exactly the same thing, and they copy it, right? And then they don't actually check to see if they're accurate. They don't check to see if they're the most accurate. They don't check to see if it's even a viable question. Oh, wait, there can't be a definitive answer. I shouldn't be asking this. This is literally a trick question. But in this case, it's a trick question that I think you can definitively say, under no circumstance would it be acceptable to take the 01 as the answer. If you did it and said, well, according to every major government, the ISO 8601 standard says there was a 0 year, and therefore the common usage is the only appropriate usage. The calling the other one strict isn't even correct. They use the term strict to imply it's more correct when it's actually less correct. It's sloppy, right? It's uninformed. It's not mathematically sensible. It's not easily usable. And the only reason to say it is to be a jerk, right? It's the, I knew something that you don't know. And it's completely pedantic and useless, right? And there's never been a time where you could prove it was correct. There's only been a time where it was more accepted as being correct, and eventually the world got together and said, that's so stupid, we're going to document that far and away, clearly beyond a shadow of a doubt, it is not correct. So if anyone ever asks you, if you ever get stuck in this trivia question, bring this video, because in any way, there's no argument that I've heard given for why you could accept the 01 as an answer, other than we'll just accept anything as an answer. Okay. That's fine. You want to define your own centuries, that's cool. Because you can, right? You can make up any set of centuries you want. The idea that something's the first century or something that's the 1900s, you can't really redefine what is the 1900s because the name says what it is, right? You're trying to redefine English. But if you want to say what is the first century, well, you can say what is the first century starting when, right? And everyone can start what is the first century since Columbus? Well, that would be starting in 1492. Right, when's the second century start? In 1592, right? That would be another first and second century system. So if you're going to say what is a first century system of the numbering of the calendar, you're pretty much stuck going with year 0 because that's how the calendar works. If schools are not teaching that there's year 0, and I don't know because this is, the official that there's a year 0 hasn't come about since I was taught calendars as a kid, but it existed before then. It has existed for hundreds of years. It's also known, or has been known since Cassini, which is, I believe, the 1780s, but it may be a lot older than that. They call it the astronomic calendar, and it is the Gregorian calendar with the 0 there, and it is listed now as both the Gregorian and the astronomic or whatever calendar. Both use 0, but the use of 0 as the starting date has been around for hundreds of years, definitely since before the founding of the United States of America. So any argument that there's some historic aspect to it doesn't make sense. So yeah, I'm pretty adamant that having done my research and really digging into this, because I hate when there's trivia that's pedantic and correctional and wrong. Like, if you want to teach people stuff and get it right, that's cool. Like, learning is good. But if you're going to correct somebody, make sure you're correcting them that they're correct. this goes back to my tax discussion, right? The whole reason that we had this lengthy tax discussion earlier this week was because we posted really basic, well-known, very obvious tax information, and some person jumped on and was like, you are wrong, and stated completely incorrect information. And then we quoted the IRS information to them. And this is definitive, right? The question is not like the calendar where you can be like, well, they say that, but I don't believe them. Okay, but the whole discussion was, what does the IRS believe? And when we quoted the IRS, they got mad and said we were just trying to mislead people, right? Like, I'm just reading the IRS site. So they had posted incorrect information only to be intentionally wrong so that they can then have an argument about it. And this is a tactic you can use to make it sound like someone's being argumentative, right? Correct something that's correct, and then when they defend that it's correct, well, of course they have to defend that it's correct. If they accept something they know isn't correct, it's kind of like lying. Like it's weird. But the person who's incorrect will say things like, well, you just have to be right. No. The person who's right doesn't have to be right. They just are right. The person who's wrong but arguing knowing they're wrong, they're the one who has to be right, right? It's something you say when you know you're right. So trivia groups like Jeopardy or my high school brainstormers team, they intentionally had wrong answers or intentionally didn't do their research because they wanted to take something that they thought would trick people and accidentally tricked themselves in doing so, and they were the ones who were wrong and looked like idiots. And I have another channel that I do for IT and business, and I was talking about certification stuff and interviewing problems, and talked about how there's a certification in my industry that has a easily provable incorrect answer on 3 different exams, and each exam asks the exact same question, and each one has a different answer that they believe to be correct. All 3 can be proven to be wrong. Like, how absurd is that in an industry certification exam? And the whole thing is a trick question, right? The whole thing is try to guess how little the person writing the test knows about the subject matter, and almost none of it is about, like a completely unimportant thing. Far less important than when the century starts. When the century starts actually is kind of important because we need a universal definition so that we can say, oh, what century is it today, right? Like if you write a law, when does it apply? Well, in the United States, the law, if you say this happens in the 20th century, that has to be on 1900 to 1999, not in 2000, right? That's because the ISO standard makes it crystal clear when the centuries are. Because there's that 0 year has to fall into some century, right? The 0 century, the zeros, the first century. And so that is more important than this particular certification exam question that has no bearing to anything professional ever. And when they attempted to make it a trick question just to be like, haha, you're wrong, I knew something you didn't. And you can easily prove they had no idea what they were asking. And the same thing came up. I used to be at this job where they would do this interview. They had the one most standard interview question that they had. Everyone memorized it in the interview teams, and they all asked it. I did not. They all asked it, and the question was wrong, meaning that the question didn't have a definitive answer as asked. So the person answering the question had to come back with a question, right? If you knew enough, you would come back and say, oh, I need clarification because there's no definitive answer to what you just asked. And then if they clarified, the correct answer was never the one that they looked for. They just didn't know. They didn't know how to ask the question, nor did they know the correct answer to any of the possible clarifications. And yet it was the most standard thing, and they asked absolutely everybody. And the result is we pretty much never got people who got it right, because it was not something that anyone knew, or else they would have been corrected very quickly. Or we gave preference to people who just randomly guessed and got it right, or had been prepped by someone on the team, right? So it actually had a very negative effect that we were constantly giving preference to people who had to have been guessing, and just guessing wildly enough to get it wrong. It was a very strange situation, but those kinds of things where you're trying to be tricky like that, whether it's trivia or certification or an interview, all of it backfires. Don't try to be tricky, right? It's just dumb. If you want to ask trivia, ask just obscure, not tricky. because you're almost certainly going to trick yourself. Yeah, that was a long tirade about the year, but you know what? I think it's one of those things it's actually kind of important, and it's actually super interesting that the International Standards Organization actually addressed this, sat down and said, everyone's been using it correctly. The people who are being pedantic are actually incorrect. They're being pedantic for its own sake, not because they're actually being correct. That's the thing. If you're going to be pedantic, you'd better be correct. Right? I'm hugely in favor of correct pedanticism, pedantry, but if you're going to take the time to be pedantic, don't waste people's time by being wrong. So it's just really interesting that the ISO sat down, did this, documented it. Everybody has agreed to it for a long time. We're talking 24 years ago. Is that right? Or is it 34? 34 years ago? Wow. So for over a third of a century, the world has ratified and accepted universally that there is a 0 year. So every time someone does this, remind them, now hold on, there is a 0 AD. It's also 1 BC. The fact that it has 2 names is not a problem in any way. And you don't have to have a BC system. They also renamed the BC system at some point. It's called BCE now, right? Just because people are being weird. It makes no sense that we have BC renamed but not AD, because they both have the same reason for having been named or wanting to be renamed. Absolutely doesn't make sense. And there's absolutely no reason to believe that the original calendar system didn't have a 0. That's it. When people say it originally didn't have a 0, that is not something that's known. It was not documented one way or the other. When people say there was not zeros at the time, absolutely false. There's totally zeros at the time for so long that it would never occur to anyone that there hadn't been. And when they say that there's no standard, there is, and it includes the 0. And when you say, how do you work it out mathematically, linguistically, every single way you look at it, it makes sense one way and doesn't make sense the other. Sometimes the world actually makes sense, and people being weird are just people being weird. Thanks for joining me. Please remember to like and subscribe. Ask your questions below. Tomorrow should be interesting. We're going to be talking about our trip to Managua with the kids and all the stuff we're going to be doing. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can buy me a coffee. That comes directly to me. I get a lot of support from that, and it really means a lot, because you really don't make anything making YouTube videos. That's not a thing. And it does cost a lot to do. My GoPro 11, which is replacing this GoPro 9 that I'm on that's flaky and dying quickly, has arrived. It is in New York waiting for me. I'll get it in 3 weeks. I'm really excited to get the new upgraded image quality, and most importantly, the new water hydrophobic lens, plus the new open gate format. It's going to be good. And just having 2 GoPros is going to be really cool, because we can do more stuff with it. And we'll be moving into the new house really, really soon. That's coming up in just several days. And other than that, share with your friends online. I will see all of you tomorrow.